We're now going to talk about documentation. First of all, when it comes to documenting calibrations, there are really three things you want to take into consideration. Number one is you absolutely want the documentation from TechInfo that explains the procedure. Now you can upload this as a PDF to a third-party payer. Number two, it probably would make sense, Jake, would you agree, to take some actual pictures as an overview of the actual procedure? What are your thoughts?
Well, you're trying to translate what the procedure is actually telling you into a visual format. Remember, the person looking at that photo may not be very technical, so your photos ought to really tell a story.
And I see, Jake, that you also mentioned that we should take up some close-up pictures of the measurements. Why do you think that's important?
Well, the measurements are critical because that can change by trim level, by wheelbase, ride height. Even on the new Titan, you can have 4 different measurements depending on what trim level you're working on. So you definitely want to identify that as visual as possible.
Right, now keep in mind, we're documenting this, one, for reimbursement justification, but also to protect ourselves from any liability issues. So during the class today, what we want you to do is use your phone to document your calibrations. Why? Because your instructor may request to see your documentation. Now, keep in mind, in a shop environment, you would store all your photos with your job file, and there should be no exceptions on that. Due to the liability aspect of an ADAS procedure being performed, it is highly recommended that you document in this way through photos to verify the work has been done correctly and that these procedures are enforced. The key to reimbursement, but also to protect yourself from liability standpoint, is to ensure that you have all of your documentation. Some examples of this would be, for example, the 3 photos we described prior. One of those is a screenshot or a photo of the actual TechInfo procedure. The second photo would be like a wide view photo of the vehicle showing the targets for calibration within the photo shot. And obviously the third photo will be a close-up of the actual markings and measurements on the floor. Keep in mind, save all of your documents as a PDF from TechInfo of the exact OEM repair procedure that you are required to do on that day. In case things ever change, you still have the documentation that says this is how I needed to do it on this date and time. Fuel receipts. It may be required in order to do a proper calibration for a safe and proper repair, you've got to fill the tank up with gas. If that's the case, you want to save your fuel receipt so you can show that you had a full tank of gas on this date and time when you did the calibration. Alignment reports. Some calibrations may require that you have to do a full wheel suspension alignment before performing the calibration. It's important we get a printout of that so we can show that the alignment specifications were within the required guidelines. As well as, oftentimes, if you're getting that printout, make sure it has the right date and time on there. Pre and post repair scan reports. Again, the freeze frame data can be helpful as well to show that there was a DTC that occurred at a specific date and time. Frame specification reports. If you're using a computerized laser measuring system, make sure you have a computerized printout that shows that the unibody was within specifications. Test drives, which are often referred to as action tests, we want to document that as well. There are some companies that make a third-party application that will help you to document that the test drive was done according to the manufacturer's guidelines. Some shops will also use things like a GoPro or their own phone. Lastly, you want to have a copy of your final repair bill. And on that final repair bill, you want to ensure you have good line notes justifying why things needed to be done. This is a summary of your claims file documentation. Oftentimes, Jake and I will get questions about labor times for calibrations. While it is against antitrust laws for us to discuss labor times, suggest labor times, what we can tell you is about a great resource, and that resource is the www.degweb.org website. If there's an estimating system, CCC Metro Autotex, that publishes a labor time that you disagree with, you can go to this website, www.degweb.org, and you can submit an inquiry, or it's called an RFR, request for review. And you can explain why you feel that time is inadequate and why you should be paid more. And we've seen a lot of shops have great success with submitting an inquiry to the DEG. Test driving the systems. Test drives are an important part of verifying the fix after repair is discovered. Now, test drives, Jake, you say they should be identified by system and properly documented on the repair order. What are some considerations we want to think about when it comes to test drives?
Well, a little bit of a fun fact, Mike. If you think about the radar systems, radars can be inherently dangerous to certain people. People that may have a heart condition or have a pacemaker or something like that. So even certain repair procedures will warn about turning a radar on with a scan tool if somebody has a pacemaker and is near the radar. So for that reason, the radars actually turn on when the wheels start turning. So you want to determine what is the set condition, mile per hour, that the radars turn on. Also direction of travel, so in reverse or in drive. So the blind spot radars in particular have two jobs. Rear cross traffic alert only works in reverse, blind spot monitoring works in drive. So when you're doing those test drives, you want to identify your direction and your speed.
Right, some other considerations for test drives are again, speed, how fast, 20 miles an hour or above, 20 miles an hour or less. Distance, do I need to go 2 feet or 2 miles? Length of time, do I need to drive the vehicle for 15 seconds or 15 minutes? We also need to make sure when we're researching these test drives, we also know what road conditions, such as lane markings or signs on the side of the highway. We also want to know about the pattern. Some vehicles may require that you drive them in a straight line, some in a figure eight, or some in an actual circle. So ladies and gentlemen, lots of considerations, but at the end of the day, TechInfo is always going to be the go-to source for understanding how these test drives should be implemented or performed.
Where the shop is also geographically can play a role. So if your shop is in downtown Los Angeles and the traffic is really bad, you may have to drive to the suburbs to meet the mile per hour requirement. So keep that in mind. Always identify a track where you're going to test vehicles.
Absolutely correct. So again, when you're thinking about your labor time or judgment time on your estimate or your repair plan, that time can vary based on where you live at. I may have to drive 15 minutes to get to a highway that has lane markings. Other shops may have to drive 20 minutes or 5 minutes. You know, Jake, you also mentioned earlier that some systems require wheel speed data and specific gear position to be met before the system even turns on. Can you explain a little bit about like the blind spot monitoring system on the Maxima that will only turn on above 20 miles an hour?
In the Maxima, the blind spot radar actually has two jobs. It can have rear cross traffic alert, which is used in reverse and typically in tight parking situations, or it can have blind spot monitoring, which only works in drive above a certain mile per hour.
So in this specific instance with the blind spot monitoring system, we may have to do a test drive in reverse and one going forward. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Oftentimes, Jake and I get asked, well, is that a billable operation, test drive for diagnostics? It absolutely is. If in doubt, you can submit an inquiry to the degweb.org website. In regards to collision repairs billing for test drive for diagnostics, this is a question that is included in our Collision Advice Who Pays for What surveys that we do in the fourth quarter of every year. The data you're seeing right now is from 2019. You will see that in 2019, collision repairers said they only got paid, always or most of the time, approximately 19% for test drives. However, ladies and gentlemen, when we look at the data a little bit further, Jake, we see that over 65% of collision repairers said, I've never even asked for that. Ladies and gentlemen, it's kind of a really basic principle. You have not because you ask not. Your instructor will now walk you through a discussion related to documentation and test drives.